Bonjour à tous, merci d'être là nombreux malgré la chaleur ambiante. Alors nous allons entamer cette session, numérotée session 11, qui est consacrée au populisme et de façon plus large à l'articulation qui peut intervenir entre d'un côté les populismes sur le plan économique et puis les effets que l'on peut observer sur le plan politique et en particulier sous l'angle des menaces que ces politiques peuvent éventuellement laisser planer sur l'exercice de la démocratie. Alors, en tant que membre du Cercle des économistes, je vais proposer un certain nombre d'observations sur un plan relativement général. Mais auparavant, je voudrais présenter les participants à cette table ronde, à cette session. D'abord, Oya ÖZARSLAN, qui est parmi nous, qui est juriste, spécialiste de questions de compliance, de gouvernance ou bien d'intégrité. Elle est inscrite au barreau d'Istanbul et de New York et elle siège au conseil d'administration de Transparency International, notamment de Transparency International Turquie. Ensuite, Diana MENHEM, qui est à mes côtés, qui est économiste, qui a travaillé dans le privé mais également au sein de plusieurs organisations internationales, notamment au sein du bureau des Nations Unies à Beyrouth. Et elle dirige aujourd'hui une ONG, Kuluna Irada, qui œuvre en faveur d'une réforme politique au Liban. Nous devions avoir également deux intervenants qui malheureusement n'ont pu se trouver parmi nous, en l'occurrence Roberto GUALTIERI, qui est le maire de Rome, mais qui est bloqué à Rome par le Covid, et puis Andreas GOERGEN, qui est secrétaire d'État en Allemagne et qui lui est bloqué par des problèmes d'avion. Et enfin, en distanciel, nous aurons le plaisir d'écouter également parmi nous Hakim BEN HAMMOUDA. Est-ce que tu nous entends, Hakim?
Yes, oui. Yes, but I'm more hearing the translation than your own speech.
Ok. Et qui, quant à lui, est économiste.
So, Hakim is an economist. He has held various posts at the African Development Bank. He was Minister of the Economy and Finance in Tunisia, and today he presides a think tank, an independent think tank, at the Global Institute for Transitions in Tunis. So there we are. That's it. Though these people are the speakers for this session. So, as I said, I would like to make a certain number of initial observations before handing over to our speakers. The first point, what is populism? It's not a political doctrine. It's not an economic theory. It's not even ideology. It's more of a rhetoric that instrumentalizes the feeling and the ill-being of populations. It's a political posture so that elections can be won. But it's also a posture that gives access to power and the implementation of a certain political strategies that are not necessarily homogeneous. They're more heterogeneous because there are left-hand populisms, right-hand populisms, there are macroeconomic populisms, and there are microeconomic populisms focused on protectionist policies, for example. However, there are invariables in populist policies, and let me cite some of these. First is the opposition between the people and the elite, or the denunciation of the distance established between different people. That consequently leads to the justification of redistribution policies at a large scale. Among other invariables, there's the objective to reconquer national sovereignty faced with the constraints limiting the action of nation-states because of globalization and because of threats coming from abroad. abroad, being understood in the large sense of the term, including imports, foreign companies, and immigrants. Populism, it's also a refusal of a certain number of orthodoxies from a microeconomic point of view, from a monetary point of view, and a budgetary point of view, or even with this idea of condemning the idea of free trade. So this is a brief overview of the outlines of different types of populism. Now, the second point, as a start to this subject, does economic populism work? What are the consequences of it? What are the effects of it? To know whether it works or not, we need to remember what the main measures are that are applied by populist leaders when they get to power. So, salaries are increased in the private and public sector. Monetary financing happens for covering budgetary deficit. These deficits then go up because of an increase in public expenditure. There's an increase in tax rates for rich people, but also for companies. There's a recourse to administrative measures to block prices. And there's also the implementation of protectionist policies. These are just some of the properties of populist economic policies, such as we saw before wars in many Latin American countries, such as we have seen also in the United Kingdom with Brexit, but also with the policy implemented by Donald Trump, that we can also observe, I believe, in Turkey today and in a certain number of other countries that may implement policies that are similar, that are connected to populism. Now, in many, many cases, and in almost all cases, in fact, after an improvement of purchasing power, employment, growth, it's these policies that are faced with high constraints, and then there are opposite effects rather than benefits. So hyperinflation often appears, and also there are bottlenecks when it comes to the supply and companies, and this leads to a great slowdown in economic activity or even crises. And according to the case, these experiences give rise to social unrest, major political changes in the democratic framework, but also to political regimes that are increasingly authoritarian, if not totalitarian. And consequently, that justifies the question that is going to be dealt with in this session, which is a contradiction between the implementation of these policies that we qualify as populist and then the durability of democracy in the countries where there is populism. So this is a very rough picture that I have painted, but I would like to conclude with two questions for our guest speakers, but also Hakim Ben Hammouda, who is in Tunis. So here's the first question. Should we reject economic policies that have been qualified as populist up until now? It's striking to observe that a certain number of aspects relating to these policies, to a certain extent, have been already implemented in industrial countries since we've had recurring crises. So the financial crisis that started in the United States, the COVID crisis, and then, of course, the repercussions of Russia's attack on Ukraine. So at the end of the day, non-conventional monetary policies, budgetary policies that are often qualified as whatever it costs. These are policies that are similar, to policies implemented in countries that are considered as populist. So there's the question. This experience that we have of populist economic policies, should it be rejected, given that usually they lead to failures, or is there anything that we can take on board, given the context of crisis that we are experiencing for many reasons that we've talked about since the beginning of the meeting. Now, Danny Roderick, many of you probably know this person, an American economist, a Harvard professor from Turkey, opposed what he referred to as the good and bad populist policies. So good populist policies are the policies that tend try and compensate, offset the effects of inequality or unfairness resulting from globalization. Bad populism is when things go wrong, when democratic rules are questioned, when public freedoms are not respected. Can we differentiate between the two? Isn't there some form of determinism in political populism? Are we not necessarily attacking democracy with these populist policies? Other authors say the opposite. They say that to a certain extent there's a real level of determinism when this kind of policy is implemented, when failures begin to appear very quickly. There is a certain level of degenerescence. There's a deterioration in public freedom, and democracy is questioned. So these are some observations that I wanted to share with you in order to introduce the debate. And as of now, I'm going to hand over to Oya ÖZARSLAN, who's going to speak to you about her experience in Turkey.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm afraid I'm going to be speaking in English. And also, I'm afraid I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to be able to make economical analysis. But I'm going to be trying to touch the points of cultural and social aspects of populism. And maybe from the area that I'm working, anti-corruption. Maybe I can also talk about the relations, how corruption affects populism, and it's also affected by populism. And populism has risen all over the world recently, and it's consistently. And as we know that only in Europe, the parties that the populist parties have tripled their support in the last 2 decades. I mean, I guess it used to be sort of a phenomenon that is on the political infringe. But now, today, it's more like a mainstream development. And it's one of the significant developments in the world shaping our world. What is populism, and what does populism to societies? Populism is basically a divisive rhetoric that pits people against elite. It actually divides societies into two, the people and the others. Or as a famous narrative, us and them, and it creates enemies in the societies. Whatever the type of the populism, I guess there are 3 main features inherent in populism types. First, it attacks and it hijacks the state apparatus. And then second, it increases the corruption and mass clientele. And then the third, it systematically suppresses civil society. So when I look at from this point of view, I can easily say that the populism is not actually beneficial to democracy at all. So I don't know. I mean, Danny Roderick, he's Turkish and he's also living in the U.S. So I'm not going to be able to get into what good comes from populism and it's, what's not. But maybe if there is only one thing that I can say about good in populism, it brings people to vote. It actually provokes people to vote more. And then it also increases awareness on certain issues like corruption. But for what goal? For what aim? I think that's the most important one. And you know, what happened to the society? What happened to our democracies around the world? And then, so how and why these liberal democracies, long-standing democracies, turn out to be the sort of regimes that also feeds into, you know, undemocratic impulses. You know, I think one of the significant factor is corruption, and I'm going to come to that. But maybe we should look at other factors, such as, you know, populism is indeed a bigger symptom of a bigger and structural problem. This is the deep-seated political, economical, and then the cultural grievances in societies. These are the issues that, you know, unaddressed grievances, or inequalities, or non-functioning politics, unworking institutions. These are actually the main areas that create populism around the world. And one of the significant factors is also corruption. Is high or rising corruption has found to be very useful tool for populists around the world. I mean, this is a paradox actually, because you know, the corruption is facilitating populism, but populism is also corruption, facilitating corruption as well. Populist leaders, they usually use the corruption as a very convenient tool, attacking against the established politics, constitutional democracy. But when they come into power, they, you know, unlike their promises, they perform very poor when addressing corruption. And on the contrary, they even weaken and worsen the whole system. Because they not only do not address the corruption, but they also target independent judiciary, free media, and also accountable institutions. You know, these are the main tools that we actually, when we address it, to fight against corruption. When we look at around the world, there are, you know, very different systems around the world, and then very dissimilar political system, but they seem like they are working, when they have the populist leader, they seem like they are working in the, you know, with the same mechanics and the same tools. I mean, remember that, you know, Donald Trump and, you know, Erdogan of Turkey, you know, when they were power, they actually appointed their next kin to very influential positions. So they actually work very similar tools. And when you look at it, they stir up national movements. For instance, in some countries, with the national resource countries like Venezuela, Kazakhstan, they pledge that they're going to protect the national resources. But when they come into power, they actually give grants to their clientele or kin or supporters of their system. So, so all in all, I say that, you know, corruption is one of the most moral underpinning when it comes to populism. What actually also does the populism into the society, it weakens accountable institutions. And when you don't have the accountable institutions, and when you don't have the separation of power, for instance, then your democracy is actually in retreat. Democracy is in trouble all around the world. And I mean, we're not only seeing it from our own experiences, but we also look at some, very known international organizations like Transparency International, Freedom House, Amnesty International, Reporters of Without Borders. And when we look at it, we see that, for instance, corruption is stagnating around the world for the last decade at least. And freedom of speech is under attack, and freedom of media as well. So it actually goes hand in hand with these populist regimes. And, and it's from Hungary to Turkey to Philippines to US, and it's actually emerging around the world. When it's emerging around the world, it enables grand corruption and it enables autocracy. So it's actually a very vicious cycle. What can we do about it, and is there any way that we can get rid of populism? But before going that, maybe I should try to answer one of your questions. Is there any good or bad populism? I'm not an economist once again, and I'm not going to get into those macro or microeconomic analysis. But I can say is that when you have a populist leader in power, they usually tend to protect their supporters. So even if there is a left or right populism, whatever that is, in that specific country, they will try to tend to protect their supporters, and then the distribution of wealth in the society, and then the public resources actually could be unevenly given to their own supporters. So it is actually going to create much more deep polarization and also inequality in the world. So I mean, to my view, even though if it's left populism, as you see in the Latin America, which is basically that in the left populism, they usually target big corruptions or political elite against people, against the pure people, as they say. But at the end, it is going to also distort the economical factors and indicators. And I just like to conclude that if we are going to be able to, recover from populism, and in that sense, I actually would like to point out the role of the youth in society, because when it comes to youth, I just like to point that democracy is actually making a choice. But in order to make a choice, you have to have the informed choice. You have to have the information, necessary information. Surveys indicate that young people around the world, they seem to be less interested in politics. And in one of the Eurobarometer surveys from 2015, it indicated that the people, young people, actually they're not interested in politics. They don't want to be a party member. They don't want to run, and so that's one of the dangers of the society. And the secondly is that the young people, they are also less interested in news. They have totally different news consumptions from the older part of the society. They don't actually look at the media outlets. They only mostly look at the social media. And the social media, yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be a democratic platform, but we see that, especially in authoritarian countries, there are army of trolls, going around the social media. And then there are very toxic feedbacks. There are ecosystems. There are bubble rooms. So it actually is not working for the favor of democracy. And in order to get rid of the danger of disengage youth, I think we should create an ecosystem of information, the truthful information. What we need is actually democracy defenders. We need leaders from the public, from the youth, for instance, to reclaim the political arena for its citizens once again. We need stronger civil society to hold account to power. And we need actually, all the indication of democracy, because, I mean, we cannot just drop the ball. We are living here, and we have to defend the democracy. And, one of the main liberal values, basic values of the democracy, functioning institutions. So we have to find a way, the accountability, putting accountability on the table and putting functioning institutions on the table. So it's actually, it's on us, it's on the people. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, before giving you the floor, I would like to remind you that if you do have questions, please send us the question go to the website, so that for logistic reasons, we'll be able to get all the questions, and we'll synthesize with that to our speakers. Diana, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Taking the time today. I'm trying to focus my intervention on an analysis of populist movements in Lebanon. Lebanon is not a democracy. It's a country in, hopefully, democratic transition. And it has been a country that has seen widespread populist movements, particularly after its post-war era. Actually, post-independence, but mostly in its post-war era. We're talking about 1990s onwards. And these were populist movements that were mainly political and not economic in nature, that focused mostly on identity politics, and that were sectarian-based. So they were movements that were based on the sectarian identity of the people that adhered to them. If you're a Christian Maronite, you'd adhere to a certain sectarian leader with a very strong discourse. If you were a Sunni Muslim, you'd adhere to another leader, and if you're a Shia Muslim, you'd adhere to a third. And the entire post-war period was basically a struggle between these populist and confessional discourse, and the sectarian leaders had a very powerful value proposition. I protect the sect, and I provide services, and amidst a deterioration and a complete deterioration of the state, access to services and protection, physical protection mainly, was key to the survival of these sectarian leaders. And really, movements were typical to populist movement. They were centered around a leader that was viewed to be strong, enlightened, etc., and that was supposed to be taking care of their own constituency. With those movements and with those discourses came the application of economic policies that were necessary, one, for these sectarian leaders who were sharing power in the state, to exploit the state, to make sure that they would perpetuate their power and their presence in the state, and at the same time for them to appease the masses. Two main tools were used. They were very powerful for a very long period of time. I'm talking here economically. The first was the stabilization of the exchange rate, so a peg against the US dollar. It has allowed the population to consume way above its means for a very long period of time. And at the same time, pumping of money, despite the incurrence of huge debt, into the public sector in order to inflate the public sector as much as possible and to use it as a tool to employ more and more people. It was a main channel of clientelism, actually. The public sector was a main channel of clientelism. Obviously, these this defected monetary policy that was not based on any rationale, on any balance of payment rationale, on any actually growth rationale, and at the same time, the policies, the fiscal policies that were also very aggressive and very much focused on expanding the public sector, came to a bust. And we've witnessed this bust in 2019, and in a classical mode, we're seeing basically huge inflationary pressure, huge depreciation of the national currency, and very quickly, we're talking about an IMF program. And eventually, these policies that kept this political class sustained for a very long time were no longer doing the job, and they were faced with a reality. But also, something else happened in parallel, and it was very interesting. So people for the longest time in Lebanon were divided along sectarian lines. They vote along sectarian lines. They adhere to sectarian leaders, as I mentioned earlier. So, and also, as Oya explained, these populist discourses led to a real decrease in the levels of accountability. People never voted for a person based on whether they would get a road paved or get the right economic policies. They just voted for them because they represented, in terms of perception, right? They represented the interests of their own sectarian clan. But what happened in 2019 was extremely interesting because emerging political groups started regrouping adherents along new lines. And they were, yes, new populist lines, but they were lines that were based on the class struggle. So talk about the 99% versus the 1%. Talk about that the sectarian elite is capturing the state, and that regardless of your confession, if you belong to the 99%, this is where your struggle should be. So detach yourself from your sectarian leaders and come join a new type of struggle, which is a real struggle for socioeconomic rights. And this was a huge wave that came on the foot of the economic crisis and with what we call revolution, which is closer to like a huge uprising that started on October 17, 2019 in Lebanon. And for the first time, and the youth, yes, that were disengaged from politics for a very long time, found a new secular movement that at the same time was talking a socioeconomic discourse. And it was very interesting because 2 years later, 15 May 2022, the parliamentary elections came. And yes, this discourse sold. I mean, we didn't get sterile results. The system in Lebanon is very strong. You still have the sectarian leaders that are in power. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not really a democracy. This is a sectarian power-sharing system. The real power lies outside of the democratic institutions. We also have an armed militia that actually sets the pace of political engagement in the country. But what happened was that you have, for the first time, a new bloc that came into parliament that was non-sectarian, that was secular, and that for the first time was talking economics, public policies, and what benefits the people. But juxtapose this against the need for an IMF program, against the need for tightened monetary policy and a lot of fiscal constraints. And you are faced with a new dilemma. Will the new MPs or the new representatives of this movement be able to move from a populist discourse to more pragmatic policy making in the heart of institutions? And this is a real test. We're faced now with countless policy decisions in Lebanon. We've been trying to get an IMF program for the past 2.5 years with no success because the political class has been extremely resistant to the IMF program. We're faced now with new populist movements that are saying, listen, we need to spend more on social protection. We need actually to redistribute wealth. We need new taxation policies, but also with the real need for financing from an IMF program that's saying you can't spend money that you don't have. And this is a real test today to this movement, whether it will be sustainable or not, whether this discourse will be sustainable or not, is for us to see, but it's a new experience. There's so much at stake. And actually, even if the entire economic aspect goes to bust, what we will retain and what will be extremely valuable is that for the first time, the Lebanese are grouping along their interests as classes and not along their sects. And this is new and revolutionary.
Bien, merci beaucoup, Diana.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you. So I will now give the floor to Hakim Ben Hammouda in Tunis. Can you hear us? Very well. You have the floor. Thank you, André. And this is one of the advantages of this pandemic, is that we are now able to use those hybrid meetings so we can be present physically or not. Anyway, André, I'm very happy to be with you, to take part in this event, which is essential and which is a great space for reflection in the French-speaking world. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you physically this year for professional reasons, but I do hope that next year, I will be with you. André, the theme, the picture you drew at the beginning is quite exhaustive, and I want simply, or I would like to add a couple of elements. Well, we have the same economic background. I heard our two colleagues, Oya and our colleague from Lebanon, with a lot of attention, and I would like to add small points in the picture you drew initially. I would like to talk about 3 points, important points. First, the interest economics pay to populism. I have to say it's very old interest, but not quite significant. Not large, significant enough for those who want the economists to get involved. The way economists think or ponder the question of ponder on the populism, they should read the great book coordinated by André CARTAPANIS and published by the Cercle des Économistes, which is a remarkable book which fills a huge gap when it comes to the economic literature on populism, and especially in the French-speaking world. So, economists pay attention to this, but their center of investigation work was always Latin America, because Latin America was, historically speaking, as you said, André, the site of development of populism, economic populism, almost since the 50s. Since the 50s, we know populism in economists through the study of development experiences that took place in Latin America. All Latin American countries went through populistic processes or phases where in the 90s there was the macroeconomics dominant, tax dominance. We wanted to meet the resolve the problem through major investment in fiscal policies, and then we had the different form, which is the macroeconomic, which drew decisions on businesses, investment, and so on and so forth. Well, so we know this, but as you said, André, there is something that is essential. The starting point of populisms, and the starting point of populism in Latin America was always took place in a complex of high inequalities and at the economical level of a low growth rate, a macroeconomic environment that with low growth and and large social inequalities. This is where the economic populism started. You want to move investment or thing because they were convinced that the best way to changing, the best way to fight against social inequalities was growth. We haven't yet had the discussion on the growth that does not create jobs, but it was the classic vision. And from then on, the different phases, we know that populism goes through different phases. The expansion phase, then the advent of difficulties, and then the phase where clearly everything collapses, inflation rises, and the imbalance of accounts increases, and the situation is such that and we ask the international institution to overcome this situation. And this is what we see in the economic literature. If they start from good intentions, which was to fight against inequalities and to boost growth, but they, because of the end up with harsh austerity policies, which turn against those who were supposed to serve. So clearly there is major interest, even though they... Anyway, there is always the question of economic populism, but despite all the characteristics, there is a true... This economic literature did pinpoint a real problem, and the real problem is the issue of inequalities, social, and the growth. And this is the question we ask today in different terms, which is the inclusive growth. How do we make sure that we'll have inclusive growth? We create jobs, solidarity, and solve inequality. And what has been said at the time, what was said at the time was the answers given were answers dealt with some of this paper, but there is so how can we build inclusive growth? Second point, it is the globalization of economic populism. As I said, populism was clearly, in terms of reflection, in terms of economic policies, was a field of reflection and studies where we'll find non-economists, but it was limited to geographic area. Now, Now there's a new phenomenon, that is, it is the development at the global level. That is, the populist temptation is found all over the world. I live in Africa and the Arab world, and the populistic temptation where it was foreign to the economic and political tradition, but we see it now. Clearly, it is growing a bit more and being installed, and there are vocation and parties who claim to be or having the same discourse, betrayal of elites at the economic level, the betrayal of elites, and and giving the and different form of democracy, and this is also fine. If you look at Asia, we see it in the Philippines, in certain Asian countries, and we see it as well at the heart of liberal democracies in the European Union, Hungary, and other countries, and of course, as you explained, André, in some aspects, the policies applied by the Trump administration is very close to the economic populism. So the question we could ask ourselves is, why is there a globalization and the politistic economic temptation? And I think one element of answer is the idea, the best environment, having the best environment. Well, they have to. It is often to show the level of corruption of some population. This is an argument used by the various populist movement. But the most important thing is clearly the crisis of globalization. Books of Thomas Piketty or even works of institutions like the World Bank. Horowitz shows the impacts of inequality, of marginalization, and basically of the descaling of certain social classes. And we end up with democracies where democracy lost its social content and the base, and what remains are the political institutions. That was, I think, the key element of this, of the rise of populism at the global level, of this development at the international level, and of course the temptation. We've seen the French elections with the temptations of. We can discuss the positions, but anyway, do we find that in every country of the world? With the same complaints that we find in Latin America. The same complaint about the government, with the movement that prevented this drift of complaints about the independence of central banks, of regional integration, the attempt of regional integration which impose supranational roles in terms of tax or in a certain number of things, in terms of against countries which develop policies or which impose some rules. Functioning rules in terms of funding or through central banks, budgetary deficit, or other things. So clearly, the same phenomenon in Latin America, or the quest of a social contract and of inclusive growth, of inclusive economic growth, as it was at the origin of unfortunate experience of economic policies in Latin America. It is at the heart of a temptation of global economic populism. Third point I'd like to mention now, it's a century-old question, what to do? What should we when our Lebanese colleague mentioned a series of question and answers, clearly we come back to all the discussions. Is there war between economic third way between economic populism, whose dangers and drifts are serious, not only at the political level, but also at the political level, but also austerity policies. I can see, for example, the austerity policies imposed today after the period of opening from the national institution, especially at the time of the pandemics, and today, after the pandemics, and today, at the time of the war in Ukraine, So we see some kind of normalization of economic policies, and we're back to normal, and the objective is macroeconomic stabilization, so we have to reduce deficits, and from then on, We have to reduce expenditures. And even we know in Tunisia they want to stop social subsidies. You know, I'm not a I've loved done in my career in a institution, but I think we have to think about a certain number of things. It is important today to think about what policy, what answer is to be provided today to a social crisis. Well, we have states which today cannot provide to help the citizens and to help unable to have dynamic policies and proactive in terms of jobs. And a country like Tunisia, for example, or many other Arab-speaking countries or Maghreb countries which belong to the intermediate economies. We went through the COVID-19 as because it was a drama, because it was the deterioration of the structures and health policies, you know. So, sorry, clearly there is a new reflection to be launched, and this a reflection that if France has started, and I think for us, you at the Cercle, les Rencontres du Cercle et les INEX, and think tanks like the one I'm facilitating in Tunis are synonym of reflection, how to pull out of this closure and this blocking between austerity and, on the other side, the temptation to break all this and to impose new economic policies. We can only lead to a third way. I think research attempts are being made. We have to see today. We have to see the experience of negotiation between Brazil and Argentina. Argentina, with support of Stiglitz, and well, has been able to achieve an agreement. Well, the gross dimension prevails over the conventional notion of austerity. We'll see what this will say. So we have to conclude now.
So in economics, we think that crisis periods are periods of innovation where there should be thinking. It's what Daniel Okri says. We have to experiment during these periods. We have to launch new experiments. Yes, that was very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hakim. So 2 questions were asked, but unfortunately we won't have time to continue. But I will pass them on to our guests. Let me just say a few words to conclude. What struck me, based on the 2 notions of globalization of populism, is the parallel that we can see between the collapse of the international regime that we had after the war, including international rules. What's striking is that all countries impacted by populism are countries that were highly indebted from the point of view of the other countries. So there were public and private financiers who didn't really worry about what was happening. I'm sorry, we no longer have the sound in the interpreting booth. Excusez-moi, j'ai